Alright, hi, howdy, welcome to Unit 4 Study Objectives. We're going over Pavlovian conditioning and its applications. So, Pavlovian conditioning. Pavlovian conditioning is not about teaching dogs to slobber at the sound of a bell, nor is it about learning that one event predicts another. Pavlovian conditioning is about one of the major ways that events change our behavior, including the behavior that we call thoughts and feelings. Understanding Pavlovian conditioning is central to understanding people, including ourselves. Alright, so Ivan Pavlov was a physiologist who studied the physiology of digestion. One of Pavlov's goals was to understand how the body breaks food down into chemicals that can be absorbed into the body. Now, since this process starts with the salivary reflex, Pavlov developed surgical procedures that let him actually study the digestive processes of animals over a long period of time. What Pavlov essentially did here was he devised surgical procedures to measure digestive fluid, and this eventually led him to learn about what he called psychic reflexes, or learning, because he eventually noticed that dogs would salivate in anticipation of meat powder even before actually being presented with the stuff. Pavlov wondered why the researcher's footsteps resulted in salivating. Involuntary behavior will crop up when the right stimuli are presented. Now that's important. Classical conditioning involves involuntary behavior. From his observations, Pavlov concluded that there are two distinct types of reflexes: unconditional and conditional. Unconditional reflexes are largely inborn, usually permanent, and found in almost all members of a species. Unconditional reflexes tend to vary little from individual to individual, so we see very little variety from person to person, from animal to animal when it comes to unconditional reflexes. On the other hand, conditional reflexes are not present at birth. Instead, conditional reflexes are acquired through experience and are relatively impermanent. Conditional reflexes also vary considerably from individual to individual. All the process of classical conditioning is about developing a conditional response. So let's get the terms down. Alright, components of the unconditional reflex. We have the US, which is the unconditioned stimulus. This is a stimulus that elicits an unconditioned response with no prior learning. Now, no prior learning is the key point here, because this makes the unconditioned stimulus the powerhouse of the conditioning process because it is automatic. It is ingrained already. Then we have the unconditioned response. Now, the unconditioned response is the response elicited by an unconditioned stimulus. So in this, we see that the unconditioned stimulus elicits the unconditioned response. The meat powder is the unconditioned stimulus, and the drooling is the unconditioned response. The conditioned stimulus is a formerly neutral stimulus that now elicits a conditioned response. And then we have the conditioned response, which is the response elicited by a conditioned stimulus. A neutral stimulus, in the Pavlov dog example, would be the researcher's footsteps. The conditioned stimulus is the footsteps after enough pairings with the meat powder, with the unconditioned stimulus. This leads to the conditioned response of salivating, which is the same response as the unconditioned response, only now it is paired with footsteps instead of just meat powder. So keep that in mind. We're going to talk now about the process of respondent conditioning. So respondent conditioning is also known as classical or Pavlovian conditioning. Respondent conditioning is the process of acquiring conditional reflexes. Respondent conditioning is possible because we already have unconditioned reflexes. The neutral stimulus, or the NS, becomes the conditioned stimulus, CS, if the pairing is successful. So, if you have a successful pairing in classical conditioning, then the neutral stimulus will become the conditioned stimulus. And just the same, if you have a successful pairing, then the unconditioned response will become the conditioned response, right? The unconditioned response is the same as the conditioned response in a successful conditioning process. The unconditioned stimulus, right, the US, that stands alone. So if a neutral stimulus is followed closely in time by an unconditioned stimulus, which itself elicits an unconditioned response, then the neutral stimulus will come to elicit a similar response. After many pairings of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, and so it reliably elicits a conditioned response. And in this way, a conditioned reflex has been established. A good example to illustrate this is stomach virus, right? Stomach virus is an unconditioned stimulus, and it elicits the response of nausea, is an unconditioned response. You don't need to learn anything to know that a stomach virus causes nausea. It just does, right? So unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Now, if you pair in close time with that stomach virus a burrito, which is a neutral stimulus, and you do this enough times, then that neutral stimulus burrito will become a conditioned stimulus, which itself elicits the conditioned response of nausea. The process of acquiring conditional reflexes is called respondent conditioning, which is also known as classical conditioning, and as a tribute to its discoverer, Pavlovian conditioning. Now, there are two defining elements of Pavlovian conditioning. Two important points that I want you to know. For one, the behavior involved is a reflex. And for two, the presentation of the two stimuli is independent of the behavior of the organism. In other words, this second main point is that the pairing between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus occurs regardless of what the individual does. So, in classical conditioning, the animal does not have to do anything in order for the stimulus to be presented. It's not like operant conditioning, right? So in this case, stimulus, then behavior. That's classical conditioning. All right, so higher order conditioning is interesting. All right, higher order conditioning is the process of pairing a neutral stimulus with a well-established conditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus then becomes another conditioned stimulus without having to be paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Now, higher order conditioning was discovered by a student of Pavlov's named G.P. Frolov. Remember that. Higher order conditioning, that was Frolov. So ordinary classical conditioning looks like this. You have the neutral stimulus metronome paired in close time with the unconditioned stimulus meat powder, and that unconditioned stimulus naturally elicits the unconditioned response of drooling. Now, after pairing the metronome with the meat powder enough times, eventually the metronome, formerly neutral stimulus, now becomes a conditioned stimulus, and that conditioned stimulus metronome elicits the conditioned response of drooling. Higher order conditioning takes it to the next level. So this is what we were working with before. All right, so the metronome paired in close time with meat powder which naturally elicits drooling. Do it enough times, eventually the metronome by itself will elicit drooling. Now, let's take that metronome, which of course, as we know, already makes drool happen, and pair it in close time with the presentation of a black square. All right, this is neutral stimulus 2. After we do this enough times, pairing the black square with the metronome after the metronome already reliably elicits drooling, eventually the black square elicits drooling. And the black square does this without ever having to be paired in close time with meat powder, because we don't need to worry about the unconditioned stimulus with higher order conditioning when we get on to the neutral stimulus part 2, because neutral stimulus 2 is being paired in close time with conditioned stimulus 1. And conditioned stimulus 1 already elicits conditioned response 1, drooling. And you'll notice here, drooling, 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 drooling. The response is the same, but the stimulus that elicits the drool will change. We go from the unconditioned stimulus to the conditioned stimulus 1 metronome, and once conditioned stimulus 1 metronome reliably gets the drool, then we pair it in close time with a black square until eventually the black square by itself elicits the drool. With higher order conditioning, it is difficult to get third order conditioning, and it is impossible to get fourth order conditioning, because by that point the research is too far removed from the powerhouse of classical conditioning. The unconditioned stimulus, right? Remember, unconditioned stimulus, that's the powerhouse of classical conditioning. If you stray too far away from that, then it all falls apart. Now, a quick note here is that higher order conditioning greatly increases the importance of Pavlovian conditioning because this process shows that many more stimuli can come to elicit conditional responses, especially words. All right, words are especially likely to become conditioned stimuli through higher order conditioning. All right, so before we continue, I want to further explain higher order conditioning. Now, you may be looking at this and you're thinking, what am I looking at? Well, I'm gonna explain it. All right, so here at the bottom, all right, this little bit is ordinary classical conditioning. You see here we have the unconditioned stimulus, which elicits an unconditioned response. And then if you pair this unconditioned stimulus in close time with this neutral stimulus enough times, then eventually this neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, which reliably elicits a conditioned response. Now you may be saying to yourself, Spencer, this is backwards. All right, this should be at the top. You have this upside down. No, I don't. All right, this is how you should visualize higher order classical conditioning, because higher order classical conditioning, I feel like, makes the most sense if you're going up and up and up, because this bit right here is the higher order part. All right, this is the second story. We're adding on to our foundation. All right, this right here was Pavlov. All right, this up here is Frolov. All right, so now higher order conditioning, here we go. So we have this metronome, which is our conditioned stimulus, and it reliably elicits a conditioned response. Now here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this neutral stimulus, this flag, and we're going to pair it in close time with this conditioned stimulus 1. All right, well, I guess I should call this neutral stimulus 2. But anyway, so now you see that after enough times of pairing this neutral stimulus with this conditioned stimulus, which, remember, this metronome already reliably elicits this conditioned response, eventually the flag by itself will elicit this conditioned response. And so the flag becomes conditioned stimulus number 2. And this conditioned response, even though it's still drooling, we're going to call it conditioned response 2, and here's conditioned response 1. So you see, we've leveled up. That's what higher order classical conditioning is all about. This may look like a lot. I hope it helps. All right, back on track. When I last left off, we were talking about words. So stats and stats. All right, stats and stats, they studied higher order conditioning. They are the people who studied words. They found that nonsense syllables can have meaning when they are paired in close time with words that already have a firmly established meaning. Because you think about it, meaning to us is something that gets paired with words, and then if you pair those words with nonsense words, then eventually those nonsense words take on the meaning of the words that already reliably elicit the response that whatever meaning it has. So if the word sad has a negative connotation, it's only because that word has been paired enough times with that negative emotion for us to think, ah, yes, that word sad, that has a negative connotation. And so if you pair that word sad enough times with a word like yof, then eventually yof takes on the same negative connotation as sad. It's just higher order classical conditioning, but with words. And you see it's laid out here. So you have your nonsense word as a neutral stimulus. You pair it with a positive word, and that positive word already elicits a happy feeling. If you do this enough times, then eventually the nonsense word by itself will elicit the happy feeling, and the same goes for negative words. The big takeaway from here, in addition to the fact that words are really higher order conditioning at work, is that stats and stats found that we can condition happy words just as easily as we can unhappy words. So that's stats and stats. They're the nonsense syllable people. They applied higher order conditioning to words. To tell when learning has occurred in responding conditioning, classical conditioning, we can measure latency, we can measure frequency, and we can measure intensity. Latency is the interval between the onset of the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. As the number of pairings increases, the response latency diminishes. Because as latency diminishes, we can say that the pairing between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is stronger. Frequency of the conditioned response. All right, so presenting the conditioned stimulus alone every now and then in test trials will let us test how often the conditioned response occurs. And the third way that we can tell when learning has occurred is by the intensity of the conditioned response. So how much drool do you get? All right, pseudo-conditioning is the tendency of a neutral stimulus to elicit a conditioned response when presented after a strong unconditioned stimulus has elicited a reflex response. Here's an example. Sensitization is the opposite of habituation. So you just watched a horror movie and you jump at every jump scare. All right, you're really jumpy because you just watched a really scary movie. And then when you're going through your house, the phone rings really loud and you jump. You jump because in this case, you are sensitized to loud noise. Now, this is not genuine classical conditioning. All right, we've not paired the phone with any jump scares. That hasn't happened. There is no pairing with an unconditioned stimulus. Pseudo-conditioning in this way is not true conditioning because it is due solely to sensitization. So, shorthand for this, pseudo-conditioning, it's fake conditioning, it's not real, it's due solely to sensitization. There is no pairing with an unconditioned stimulus. It is only because you're really on edge, you're sensitized to something. That's pseudo-conditioning. All right, the effectiveness of respondent conditioning is in large part dependent on the temporal pairing of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Now, there are 4 basic ways of pairing stimuli. We have trace, delay, simultaneous, and backwards. Now, of these 4, only 2 of them actually work. So I'm going to run you through an example, illustrate this. So in rabbits, we're looking for an eye blink. Now, our unconditioned stimulus is a puff of air. Unconditioned stimulus puff of air naturally elicits an unconditioned response of an eye blink. Now, we want to make the rabbit blink to music, so our neutral stimulus is the music, and this will eventually become a conditioned stimulus, music, after pairing it enough times with the puff of air. With trace, we have a tiny trace of time between the music and the puff of air. This is usually a trace of time anywhere from half a second to 1 second. With delay, we turn the music on, and before we turn it off, after it's played for a little bit, then we administer a puff of air to the eye. In this case, there is no trace of time. Those are trace and delay. And the reason they're highlighted is because they're the ones that work. Simultaneous and backward do not work, and I'll tell you why. When it comes to simultaneous, we play the music at the exact same time as we administer the puff of air, and then with backwards, we puff the air and then we play the music. Since the neutral stimulus must always come first in a conditioning procedure, this backwards arrangement is no good. And simultaneous, likewise, is not good either, because it all happens together too quickly. You hear the music and you get the puff of air, and this neutral stimulus music is not salient enough to become a conditioned stimulus. So, trace and delay are our only 2 ways of effectively pairing this stuff. All right. Contingency. Yes, contingency is an if-then statement. If X, then Y. We've talked about this in previous units, so just know that during classical conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is followed by the unconditioned stimulus 100% of the time. So the greater the degree of contingency, the more effective the conditioning. There's some stuff there you can read about how this applies in the real world, but I'm going to move right along to contiguity. All right, contiguity refers to the closeness in time or space between 2 events. With contiguity in Pavlovian conditioning, we're talking about the interval between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, or neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. Right, neutral stimulus, which will eventually become a conditioned stimulus. This interval is called the interstimulus interval, or the ISI. The interstimulus interval is the time between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Now, in general, the more contiguous the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is, the more quickly a conditioned response will appear. We only have to worry about the interstimulus interval in trace conditioning. That's important because going back up to here, we see this little gap of time is the interstimulus interval with trace. whereas we don't have that with delay. Although shorter intervals are generally preferable to longer ones, the ideal interval varies in complex ways from situation to situation. So really, it just depends on the situation you're working with. The two variables that impact the optimum amount of contiguity between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus in responding conditioning are 1, the kind of response being learned, and 2, the type of conditioning procedure used, with short intervals generally being less important in delay conditioning than in trace conditioning. Now, the ideal interstimulus interval is half a second to 1 second. Now, a compound stimulus. All right, a compound stimulus is a combination of 2 or more stimuli presented simultaneously. This compound stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus for 1 or more trials, and afterwards, the experimenter tests for conditioning by presenting the compound stimulus and each component of the conditioned stimulus alone. What we're talking about doing here is we have neutral stimulus light plus neutral stimulus sound. This is our compound stimulus. So we present this compound stimulus in close time with meat powder, and of course, as we know, meat powder elicits drool. So this is our unconditioned stimulus, this is our unconditioned response, and if we present this compound stimulus enough times in close time with the unconditioned stimulus meat powder, then eventually this compound stimulus of light and sound will elicit drool as a conditioned response. And here we get into overshadowing. All right, overshadowing is what happens when the effect of one stimulus overshadows the effect of the others almost completely. The overshadowed stimulus, all right, so the stimulus that falls by the wayside, does not go entirely unnoticed, but it's just not enough to become an effective conditioned stimulus. Part of a compound stimulus will fail to become a conditioned stimulus. This often has to do with the intensity of the conditioned stimulus. So in general, stronger conditioned stimuli result in better conditioning. A good example to illustrate this is if we have a compound stimulus of light and sound, the light may be very bright and the sound may be very soft. Now, if we pair this in close time with meat powder, then eventually the compound stimulus will elicit drooling, like the meat powder did. But if the light was really bright and the sound was really soft, then presenting the light by itself will elicit drool because the light was very intense, but the sound by itself will not elicit drool because the sound was really weak. It was soft. It was not a strong enough stimuli to become a reliable conditioned stimuli. But the bright light, now that was. The intensity of the unconditioned stimulus is also very important in responding conditioning, with stronger stimuli producing better results than weaker ones. Now remember, the unconditioned stimulus is the powerhouse of all of this, and to kind of illustrate this point about intensity, when Pavlov was running his experiments, he would hit the dogs with a fat teaspoon of meat powder, right? So that's enough to get them drooling. However, he wouldn't go too intense with it, right? He wouldn't drown them in meat powder because that would be too intense. Too much of a good thing. All right, another point here. The nature of the unconditioned stimulus affects the ability of a stimulus to become a conditioned stimulus because some stimuli are inherently more likely to become conditioned stimuli than others. When conditioning phobias, people are easily frightened by spiders and snakes because that's the sort of stuff that humans back in the day were afraid of because of survival. We are less afraid of cats and rabbits just naturally. It's going to be way easier to make people afraid of spiders and snakes than it is cats and rabbits because just the nature of the unconditioned stimulus alone is enough to elicit fear. So if you're trying to condition a phobia and I show you a flag and I pair that in close time with a snake, that pairing is going to be relatively quick because we're afraid of snakes naturally, some more than others. And you'll find that to be more effective than if I were to try to pair a flag with a cat to elicit fear because, I mean, the cat as an unconditioned stimulus isn't going to get much of a fear response out of us compared to a snake because the nature of the unconditioned stimulus will affect the ability of any neutral stimulus to become a conditioned stimulus. Now, in general, conditioning proceeds best when both the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus affect either internal receptors or when they both affect external receptors. To this point, think about taste aversion, right? So if I pair a stomach bug in close time with a burrito, these both involve the sense receptors that result in vomiting. All right, latent inhibition is when the appearance of a stimulus in the absence of an unconditioned stimulus interferes with the subsequent ability of that stimulus to become a conditioned stimulus. Prior experience with a stimulus prevents conditioning from occurring. That's the essence of latent inhibition. Latent inhibition does not involve a compound stimulus. Instead of intensity being the relevant factor, prior experience is relevant with latent inhibition. A good example of this is people do not grow averse to bread and water because people have too many familiar experiences with those things to grow sick of them. There is too much latent inhibition with those things, which is why if I'm trying to make you sick of water, it's not going to happen because you've had too many experiences with it. You've been exposed to it too many times for me to ever trick your brain into thinking that it would make you sick. This is why alcoholics may not develop taste aversion because they have grown too familiar with alcohol. It's no longer a neutral stimulus. So the real problem with latent inhibition, the reason that it may prevent conditioning from occurring, is because this neutral stimulus is not truly neutral if it is not novel enough. Now, blocking is what happens when one stimulus in a compound stimulus interferes with the ability of another to become a conditioned stimulus due to prior experience with that stimulus. So going back to compound stimulus, remember the light and the sound. All right, so the light and the sound, they are a compound stimulus. If we present them in close time with meat powder enough times, then eventually that compound stimulus by itself will elicit the response of drooling. However, if our dog has some prior experience with that sound, right, maybe it's a whistle, then that sound does not produce the desired response because the dog has prior experience with that noise. Remember, the key of a neutral stimulus is that it's neutral. There is no prior experience with it. If the dog has prior experience with the whistle, with that sound, then it's already been paired with something else. And so it's not going to help our procedure when we run it. Blocking is what happens when one stimulus in a compound stimulus interferes with the ability of another to become a conditioned stimulus because there's prior experience with that stimulus. Now, there is one part of this that actually enhances conditioning, and that is sensory preconditioning. All right, so sensory preconditioning goes like this. Two neutral stimuli are paired to create a compound stimulus. So light and sound, that's a compound stimulus. One of these neutral stimuli is then paired repeatedly with an unconditioned stimulus, eventually becoming a conditioned stimulus. So you show the animal the light, you hit the animal with the meat powder, and then you get the drool. What we see here is light and meat. The meat gets you drool, and so eventually the light will get you drool. What we can do is we'll play that sound without the light, but because the animal has it in their head that light and sound are together, then the sound alone will elicit the same response as what the light did. And so we see that the sound will elicit drooling without ever having been paired with meat. So when the other neutral stimulus is presented alone, it may elicit a conditioned response, even though it was never paired with the unconditioned stimulus. Compound stimulus, sound equals drool. Light and sound is compound stimulus. You take one part of that compound and you pair it with the unconditioned stimulus enough times to where you get this unconditioned response to become a conditioned response. And then eventually, this part of the compound stimulus presented alone will reliably elicit this conditioned response because this conditioned response has already been made to happen by this half of it. All right, another factor to talk about. Number of pairings. All right, yes. Number of pairings between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus affect conditioning, in that the first several pairings are more important than later ones. Now, this makes sense because organisms that require several pairings for learning are at an evolutionary disadvantage. Now, because of this same line of thinking with evolution, people who have a certain disposition for anxiety, right, people with anxiety disorders, they're more likely to have phobias classically conditioned into them because they are at a predisposition for this sort of fear response because of their anxiety. All right, the length of intertrial intervals is another factor that influences classical conditioning. So remember the ISI. All right, so the ISI is the interstimulus interval. Now we are on to the intertrial intertrial interval, so the ITI. The intertrial interval is the gap between successive pairings. So we have a pairing, and then there's an intertrial interval, and then there's another pairing. Longer intervals are more effective than shorter ones. Longer intertrial intervals. We're talking 20 to 30 seconds. The intertrial interval lives between entire trials, whereas the interstimulus interval lives between the presentation of one stimulus and another. All right, other factors that affect conditioning, let's just rattle them off real quick. Age. For classical conditioning, younger is better. Yes, that is correct. When it comes to temperament, excitable is better. The more stress an animal is under, the faster conditioning can occur, but you don't want too much stress, right? It's a balancing act. And then biological predispositions, they also matter because we have a predisposition to be classically conditioned to fear some things more than others, to like certain things more than others, and this goes back to phobias because people are more likely to be afraid of things like heights and snakes because of our biological predispositions. All right, so I made an adjustment to what this said here. There was a little typo here that changed this part. If you look back on the footage, you'll see it, but don't worry about that now because we're just going to do a quick review, all right? Because the last 10 objectives referred to some of the variables that affect the process of responding conditioning. So the most important is the temporal pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. We talk about contingency, then contiguity. The ones above are the most important, all right? So number 1 is the pairing, then we have the contingency and the contiguity. We talk about overshadowing and stimulus intensity. We also talk about the nature of the unconditioned stimulus, latent inhibition, blocking, and sensory preconditioning. We also talk about the number of pairings, the intertrial intervals, age, temperament, stress, and biological predispositions. So real quick, just scrolling through here, we can see everything we talked about. I copy and pasted a different rendition of it. Everything you need to know right here, pretty much. And yeah, there's a lot going on here, but it's okay. I know you'll get it. With all that out of the way, let's talk about respondent extinction. Respondent extinction is the process of repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. So the example here would be ringing a bell but not presenting meat powder. This results in weaker and weaker conditioned responses until eventually we get no response at all. Now, a note here is that respondent extinction is different from forgetting, all right? Respondent extinction is not simply forgetting because forgetting is where nothing would be presented. It's more of a brain operation. With respondent extinction, we are deliberately presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. We are deliberately putting in the effort to show you the thing that we've trained your brain to think, yes, when I see this, I'll get this. We deliberately present you with it. We ring the bell, we have the researchers walk up and down the hall. We do those things, right? It's very deliberate, but we don't give you the thing it's been paired with, the unconditioned stimulus. We don't give you that, which is why it's different from forgetting, because here we are deliberately breaking the pair, this association, we are breaking it until eventually it extinguishes. Now, once a conditioned response has been extinguished, the effects of conditioning are not completely undone. And spontaneous recovery speaks to this point, all right? Spontaneous recovery is the sudden reappearance of a response after extinction. Now, you do have to warn people about this, because when something gets spontaneously recovered in, let's say, therapy, it's best for them to stay the course and push through the anxiety. Spontaneous recovery happens most likely because the brain pathway is still there. If the response is reconditioned, then the conditioned response can usually be established much more readily than it was initially. If we run a classical conditioning procedure well enough to where we have a conditioned stimulus reliably eliciting a conditioned response, and then we put that on extinction, right, to where now we have extinguished that conditioned response, and now we want to get it started back up again, so we start from square one, we'll find that this second time around, things go a lot faster, because now the conditioned response is established much more readily than it was before. The brain pathway is still there. All right, I'm going to touch real quick on some theoretical issues in responding conditioning. So the main issue here is what exactly has the organism learned when conditioning takes place. Now, there are four major theories: stimulus substitution, preparatory response, compensatory response, and the Rescorla-Wagner model. Now, you don't need to know these too much in detail, but it is worth just going over them real quick. So real quick, a shorthand for this: stimulus substitution, the conditioned stimulus simply substitutes for the unconditioned stimulus. Preparatory response is the idea that the conditioned response prepares the organism for the unconditioned stimulus. Compensatory response theory is the idea that the conditioned response helps to compensate for the effects of the unconditioned stimulus, which will ultimately elicit the unconditioned response. And then the Rescorla-Wagner model is the one that goes into how the conditioned stimulus depends on the salience of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus and the total amount of conditioning that occurs. Now, a pet peeve of behavior analysts is the need for other types of psychologists to explain respondent conditioning as associative learning. Now, this associative learning label assumes that for conditioning to occur, the organism must be aware of the developing relationship between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, or to associate the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. This is cool and all, but we have seen in research time and again that conditioning can occur without awareness. If conditioning can occur without awareness, then we can't very well say that we need to be aware of this association. This awareness view likely endures only because traditional views of the human mind and the mind in general point towards a level of awareness being necessary because there's an autonomous mind at work. But really, the point here is that knowledge is not a cause of learning, but one of the things that is sometimes learned. Sometimes you gain the knowledge of the association, but knowing it is not necessary for it to happen. Now, you may not have noticed it, but your brain did. Alright, now let's compare operant conditioning to responding conditioning. Operant conditioning differs from responding conditioning in three major ways: behavioral contingency, the types of behavior involved, and the biological structures that are involved. Starting off with the behavioral contingency, the operant model goes A, B, C: antecedent, behavior, consequence. That's operant conditioning. Whereas the respondent contingency is neutral stimulus in close time with unconditioned stimulus, which elicits unconditioned response. And then you know the drill. If you do this enough times, then eventually the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, which will elicit a conditioned response. Operant conditioning also differs from responding conditioning in terms of the types of behavior involved. We see that operant conditioning involves voluntary behavior, whereas responding conditioning is more about involuntary behavior. Reflexes like salivation or weird twitches when you poke a certain way at someone. And then, of course, we also see that there is a difference in the biological structures that each form of conditioning involves. So, skeletal muscles are involved in operant conditioning because these skeletal muscles are more voluntary, whereas respondent conditioning involves smooth and cardiac muscles. Now, let's talk about Pavlovian applications. Conditioned emotional responses. This comes to us from John B. Watson. Watson was the first guy to study human emotions systematically. He discovered that fear and other responses to stimuli are largely learned through respondent conditioning, and so his work revolutionized the treatment of phobias. We all know John Watson for his experiment on little Albert. Little baby Albert learned to fear white rats through respondent conditioning, and the fear response that Watson conditioned into Albert was generalized to other furry white stimuli. What's even cooler is what Mary Cover Jones did, treating irrational fears with counter-conditioning. Counter-conditioning is where you pair a conditioned stimulus for fear with a positive unconditioned stimulus to reverse the effects of that fear. In vivo, or in-life exposure, comes to us from Mary Cover Jones. Jones was a student of Watson who had a little boy named Peter. So what Jones did was she made Peter afraid of a bunny rabbit in much the same way Watson did with Albert. Then Jones presented Peter with his favorite snack while showing him the rabbit that he had grown to fear. After a few days, Peter was petting the rabbit, he was once afraid of while eating his favorite snack. Because you can't be happily sat with your favorite snack while also being afraid of the rabbit. Eventually, fear will give way to the unconditioned response of happiness when you're presented with this thing that you really like. This unconditioned stimulus that just makes you happy. Quick note, counterconditioning is now called exposure therapy. Counterconditioning is where the person is gradually exposed to the fear-evoking stimulus while feeling relaxed. That is exposure therapy. Another application is systematic desensitization. This comes to us from Joseph Walp. Joseph came up with a method of classical conditioning that has 3 steps. First, we have the client come in and talk about their phobia. From this, we create a hierarchy of fear, which is steps from the least anxiety-inducing thing to the most anxiety-inducing thing. Now, once we have that hierarchy, we move on to step 2, which is where we do training in progressive muscle relaxation. We train the client to counter their anxiety with PMR. This helps the client recognize when they amp up with anxiety, and it helps them combat that anxiousness. And finally, 3rd step, desensitization. We take the client through that hierarchy of things from least anxiety-inducing to most anxiety-inducing. We're just sat in the office and we're talking them through it, all right, from bottom to top. And each time they start to feel anxious, they use progressive muscle relaxation to overcome their anxiety. Eventually, by talking about their phobias like this, by having to confront the anxiety and combat it with PMR, the client overcomes their phobia. And this is all done in the client's head, all right? Systematic desensitization can be done in the office. We don't need access to anything other than what's in the therapist's office and what's in the client's head. We can also use virtual reality for this stuff, so there's that. Now, respondent extinction does play into this because remember, respondent extinction is the idea that we can present the conditioned stimulus repeatedly without the unconditioned stimulus until the association is broken. So if we associate turbulence with anxiety, but we make you think of turbulence time and again while combating your anxiety with PMR, then eventually the presentation of turbulence will not be followed by anxiety, and so the association between turbulence and anxiety will be broken, and then boom, your phobia is gone. That's systematic desensitization from Joseph Walp. Next up, conditioning of prejudice. Remember, Sats and Stats, they were the word people. So conditioning of prejudice goes back to them. According to Stats and Stats, hate is a conditioned emotional response to some stimuli. Hate is nothing more than higher order conditioning, which is why hate can be alleviated through counterconditioning. Counterconditioning, going back to Mary Cover Jones. Paraphilias. Paraphilia is a perverse means of achieving sexual pleasure. We're talking about things I cannot say on YouTube. So, here's how a paraphilia might develop. We have hormones, which are an unconditioned stimulus, which reliably elicit the unconditioned response of arousal. Alright, so this is young Ted's first time encountering a dead thing. It's a neutral stimulus, and it's paired in close time with his hormones, right? So hormones, which already elicit the arousal as an unconditioned response, eventually pairing this dead thing in close time with the hormones, Ted finds the dead thing arousing. That is how you develop a paraphilia. And again, you can treat them with aversion therapy. All right, study on conditioned taste aversion. Okay, yes. Conditioned taste aversion comes to us from John Garcia. All right, taste aversion differs from basic respondent conditioning in 2 important ways. For one, conditioned taste aversion often results from a single pairing of the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and long delays are possible between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. Or I'm saying conditioned stimulus, also neutral stimulus, because eventually neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. Point is, if I eat a burrito and it gets me sick, I don't need to eat many more burritos for me to start avoiding burritos. All right, a single pairing of that burrito with the stomach virus is enough for me to say, yeah, no, that's enough. So a single pairing is enough with conditioned taste aversion. And also, long delays are possible, because if I eat the burrito at lunchtime and then come the evening, I'm dead, I'll know, hey, I'm dead now. And it was probably that burrito that I ate all those hours ago. Latent inhibition does play a role. Latent inhibition prevents taste aversion with things like bread and water, because remember, bread and water are not truly neutral stimuli. We've had too many experiences with them for them to ever be truly neutral stimuli that we can grow sick of. We don't grow sick of them at all because of latent inhibition. Oh yeah. Okay, so Duran et al.'s study on sheep. You can condition sheep to mow your lawn for you. Sheep are nature's weed whacker. Application of respondent conditioning for environmentally sound farming practices. That's the sheep weed whacker from Duran. Just 2 more points to cover. Advertising capitalizes on conditioned emotional responses people have to particular stimuli. Advertisers pair products with stimuli that reliably elicit positive emotions. Marketers do the same sort of thing when they pair a new product with one of their popular products, which is a practice they call co-branding. Another technique is to pair competitors' products with items that evoke negative emotions. So again, basically you're looking at an ad, and this positive emotion is paired in close time with this product, until eventually, after having this done enough times, the product alone is enough to elicit this positive emotion. And it also works with competitors. If you pair your competitor's product in close time with a negative emotion, then eventually your competitor's product by itself will elicit that negative emotion. Advertising capitalizing on conditioned emotional responses. And the last point we talk about is drug overdose death. People can OD when they take the same amount of drug that they already usually take. So they haven't upped the dose at all, but they still OD, despite this being the amount that they normally take. This is the only instance where the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are the opposite of one another. So if you see a question like this, where it's like, in what circumstance is the unconditioned stimulus the opposite of the conditioned stimulus, or vice versa? It's drug overdose deaths. And the reason for that is the preparatory response. Conditioned stimuli associated with drug use result in conditioned responses that have the opposite effect of the unconditioned stimulus. If these conditioned stimuli are missing, it can result in an overdose with the usual amount of drug. Let's say I do uppers, all right? And I do the same amount of upper time and again, but I have a certain ritual when I do it. So I always take my uppers through a bendy straw, right? This bendy straw, when I have it in my hands, when I'm sat at my desk, when I'm ready to do these uppers with my bendy straw, it sends my nervous system in the opposite direction of those uppers. So if those uppers are going to take me high, then my conditioned response is going to be to go low. My nervous system is going to compensate for how high I'm about to get by going a little bit down. And then I do the uppers and then boom, I get high. And the same goes with downers, right? So if I'm doing a downer and I use a belt with it, right? Then this belt is part of the ritual. But if these elements are missing, then it doesn't cue my nervous system into what's about to happen. If I don't have my bendy straw in hand, then there's no conditioned stimulus to elicit a conditioned response. So without this conditioned stimulus, the conditioned response of nervous system compensation doesn't happen, which is why without that little bit of compensation, without that little touch of, okay, let's go down a little bit before we get high, suddenly I take the same amount I usually do, but without that compensation, suddenly I go up and up and up, and boom, I hit a lethal dose. I overdose on it because I took the same amount, but I didn't cue my nervous system into what was about to happen. That's my on-the-spot explanation. Here's what the text reads. People who use drugs have a ritual that sends their nervous system in a direction opposite of what the drug does. Again, that's the bendy straw, that's the belt, my uppers and my downers. If you mess with the ritual, you mess with the nervous system. And when you start messing with the nervous system, that is when you can possibly OD. Now, when it comes to drugs, we can also use responding conditioning in treatment. So if we take the unconditioned stimulus and pair it enough times with something like nausea in aversion therapy, then eventually the drug will elicit the same response as the nausea. Alright, another way of weakening the influence of conditional stimuli is extinction. And remember, extinction is just where we present the conditioned stimulus time and again without the unconditioned stimulus, so that eventually the association is broken and we no longer get our conditioned response. Alright, that is going to do it for Unit 4. This has been Pavlovian conditioning and its applications.